Hello and welcome. Welcome to this event. It's not a bloody trend. Let me introduce the panelists. So, on my left, we've got Ellie, who's an autistic and ADHD content creator, speaker, and author of Unmasked and How to Be You. And Kat, who's a freelance journalist and commentator, author of It's Not a Bloody Trend, Understanding Life as an ADHD Adult. So, welcome. In preparation for this event, I suppose being autistic, I over-prepared with all the notes, and I'm really hoping to put them all away here. But just so that I feel quite grounded, they'll stay here and not bother anyone. So, let's maybe start with, the whole thing around late life diagnosis, because I think that's what really, what the three of us share. We all got diagnosed, I did a bit of research, around 2020, 2021, so similar time as well. So maybe shall we start by you sharing a little bit about, how you came to seeking a diagnosis? Was there any light bulb moment? Has anything in particular led to it?
Yeah, I'll start. Mine's quite timely. Oh, I'm quite loud. Mine's quite timely at the moment, with the Euros being on. Right. So for a bit of backstory, I was always diagnosed in my teenage years as having generalised anxiety disorder, panic disorder, agoraphobia, anxiety-related depression. So it was clear that I was facing quite a lot of challenges, but they were always put down to being the mental health side of things. So that was the explanation that I'd had up until that point of why I faced challenges and why things might be more tricky for me than they are for other people. And then I had kind of been stuck in a bit of a cycle. So my worst part, or like the trickiest time I've been through, was when I was in sixth form. I ended up having to drop out of school, decline my uni offers. I was really quite unwell, spent about 6 months not really being able to leave the house, do anything, be on my own, anything like that. And that was kind of my trickiest phase. And then I would kind of go in a cycle where for every 6 months, I'd be fine, my usual self, bubbly, ambitious, energetic. I'd get myself going again. And then every 6 months, I'd crash and burn and go back to the panic, the anxiety, the low mood, all of that stuff. So that was kind of a cycle that I was in from leaving school at 17 up until being in my early 20s. And then lockdown happened, and I think we all had a bit more time to reflect on what was going on for us. And I sort of knew that this cycle was happening. And I was just adamant that I wasn't going back to that place again. I think it was really frustrating for me of I'm doing everything that I've been told to do. I'm taking these antidepressants, I'm doing the therapy, I'm reading every single self-help book, I'm doing all the right things. Why do I keep going back to that place of feeling horrendous? So I was kind of in that place of reflecting and thinking, actually, I don't think anxiety is what's going on for me, because I'm not an anxious person. Generally, I don't worry about things. I just get really overwhelmed and really, have these sort of periods of intense overwhelm, basically. So that was kind of in my head of I think there's something else going on here. I kind of went through a stage of thinking, is it bipolar? Is it BPD? Because they were the sort of only explanations I've seen of why a woman might go from being very high to very low. So that was kind of in the back of my head. And then, the Euros happened. So the Euros final was on a Sunday night, and me and my partner at the time were both very big football fans. So he had got the Monday off work, but I couldn't get the Monday off work. So I'd said to him, okay, if England win, I will stay out and I'll just deal with being hungover at work, because it's a once in a lifetime thing. But if we don't win, if we lose, I'm going to get the last train home, because I need to go home because I've got work in the morning. And he said to me, okay, whatever you do, I'll do the same. So that was in my head. He told me that he would do the same thing as me. And then England lost in penalties in the final. And I was like, okay, we're going to go and get the train. And he was like, oh no, I'm not going to go home. I'm going to go out. And I was like, but you said that you would come home with me if I was going home. And he was like, okay, well, things change. And then I brought that conversation up in counselling, that I was having some counselling at the time. And the counsellor asked me the question, why has that bothered you so much? Is it the fact that it was supposed to be a nice day and it ended on a sour note? Is it the fact that you had, were you scared getting the train home on your own? What was it that bothered you? And I was like, no, he said that he would get the train with me, and then he didn't do what he said he was going to do. So there was change, and I don't like it when people say things that they don't mean. That's why it bothered me. And then she just asked me the question, has it ever been looked into why you take things so literally? And I was like, no, it hasn't, but I think I know what you're hinting at here. And then I just went on sort of mad Google session of autism in women, autism in adults, and then that led me to ADHD in women, ADHD in adults, and it all sort of, don't worry, come in, the seat's at the front if anyone wants to come in, and yeah, that sort of led me on a sort of rabbit chase basically of what can I find information about this, and I was just completely and utterly obsessed from that point of getting hold of as much information as I could, and then from there I ended up getting so that was about probably this time of year in 2021, and then in the October I got my ADHD diagnosis. Decided to go for that one first because it felt more tangible, that I knew that I could get ADHD medication, so it sort of would be something that would change. So I got that one first in the October, and then the following April I got my autism diagnosis. So yeah, I think it was a massive light bulb moment for me. I think everything suddenly made sense. I think it was both all of those things, like the challenges that I had faced that I knew about before were explained, but also loads of things that I'd never actually known were different about me, or were challenges that I'd faced, of like, oh well, I didn't know that everyone didn't have as many thoughts as I do all of the time, or I didn't know that everybody didn't plan out conversations before they were going to have them, or I didn't know, because I've only ever been inside this brain that does that, and I've never been told that this brain's any different from anyone else's. So yeah, I think just like looking sort of through all of those, like on the NHS website, the list of traits and experiences, I think watching other people's social media content really helped me of being able to relate to other sort of women of a similar age to me that were going through the same thing. But yeah, definitely a massive light bulb moment for me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. Linking, to the topic of our session today, is it a bloody trend? Obviously, it's not a bloody trend. I think there's just so many people, and again, I think both of you captured it in your book so brilliantly, in terms of so many people being let down and not being spotted much earlier in life, especially being women. And maybe we'll go to the topic of pretty privilege. I know that that chapter for you, Ellie, was, you said it in the book, really hard to write, and it really, really resonated with me because I sometimes feel like an imposter syndrome, like an imposter in terms of my school life was, I didn't quite get along maybe with girls, but I had, my own weird hobbies. I had my thing. I even had a special program at school. It wasn't an official SEN program. It was just me doing lots of maths because I had my thing, had my focused interest. I had quite a good life, I'd say, until my teenage years. Then with hormones, things went a little bit all over the place, eating disorder also became my friend, and lots of difficulties in my 20s, 30s, and it wasn't until I got the diagnosis that I was like, okay, so much now makes sense. So, in a way, I think, when we think about that pretty privilege or having that privilege, some people might say, well, but you are so lucky, and, you have all of this, but I think there's also the darker side of it. So, Ellie, would you like to say more about, the pretty privilege?
Yeah, so pretty privilege is a term that's used to basically say like the combination of like white privilege, the combination of thin privilege, the combination of sort of falling inside what is sort of European sort of beauty standards. So if you look like somebody that would be considered pretty, generally you have a better time in life. You get sort of maybe easier time socially, maybe you're more likely to get a job because they like the way that you look. If you fit inside that, what we've been told is the ideal, then you have that privilege of maybe sailing through life a bit more smoothly, which is definitely very true in so many parts of life. But in the book I talk about how although that is a privilege, when it comes to things like being disabled or having a hidden disability, it's actually a massive sort of holdback as well, because people look at you and they see someone that's fine, someone that's normal, someone that they can't ever tell that there's anything sort of air quotes wrong with you. They would never sort of think any differently. And I think for me especially, the way that I looked meant that I sort of appeared from a distance that I would fit in with the popular kids at school, or it would get me into social situations that I didn't actually have the social skills to get me there. I just looked like I should be there, and therefore I was there. And then I think when I talk about having a really difficult time at school, people picture like a kid just stood on their own in the playground with no friends, but that wasn't the case for me at all. The case for me was I would find sort of like one popular group that would take me under their wing, and they would like me on the first instance because I looked like I belonged with them and I could mask to a certain extent to appear like I belonged with them. But then as I sort of tried to build or maintain any sort of friendship, then that would become apparent that I had a social disability. I couldn't, whatever I was doing was wrong somehow. I wouldn't know what I've done wrong, but I've done something wrong, so they don't want me. Okay, I'm back on my own. Okay, another group will take me in. Oh, well, she's got loads of friends, this girl. She just jumps between friendship groups. They wouldn't see an outsider in the playground. They would see somebody that had friends at any one time, but that wasn't actually friends. That was just that I could stand near people or sit near people. It wasn't actually that I was building or developing any friendships. It wasn't that. It was like very clear that socially I was having a really awful time. But from an outsider's perspective, that didn't look like that, because it wasn't that I just could never make friends with anybody ever. I could make friends, I just couldn't keep them. And I think that, you know, made it more difficult for anyone to realise that I had a social and communication disability, because it was just put down to, oh, you know, girls are bitches, it's horrible being a teenage girl, nobody has an easy time at school, which is true, it is the case. However, it was so much more deep-rooted of that. I didn't have the social skills needed to be able to build and maintain friendships with neurotypical people without that information as to why. So I do think that that's a really tricky thing. And I think actually now, post-diagnosis, it's something that still shows up a lot, is that when that the combination of having that pretty privilege and being a very high masking person, which means that sort of 99% of the time I'm covering up 99% of my autistic and ADHD traits. So when someone looks at me, they see what they think is a completely normal person. So when I'm asking for things and I'm saying, you know, I'm autistic, I'm ADHD, I need clear communication, I need an agenda, I need a quiet space, I need these things as a disabled person to be able to function, it sort of goes in one ear and out the other, because they hear what you're saying, but they look at you and go, she's normal, she's not disabled, she doesn't have support needs, look at her, she's fine. And then it makes it really sort of tricky that it does feel like whatever I'm saying isn't being computed, because all that they're seeing, no matter what the sound is, they're seeing she's a normal person, she's absolutely fine, because the sort of the challenges are a lot of the time invisible, or when they are visible, that doesn't happen in front of people. It's me going home afterwards and crying my eyes out because I'm absolutely exhausted and overwhelmed, or it's me going home and lying in a dark room because I'm absolutely drained from the day. But no one sees that. They just see the normal person, or the fine normal girl, which can make it really tricky for people to actually sort of compute the fact that I'm not just saying I'm autistic and ADHD for fun. I'm sharing that with you because I need you to meet these needs that the world doesn't usually meet.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining it so well. And Kat, would you like to tell us a little bit about, you know, your experience of working as an undiagnosed ADHD woman?
Oh, goodness me. Again, so much of what Ellie was just saying, absolutely the same with me as well. There was a period in 2018, 2019, when I would come home from my job at sort of, I don't know, between 5 and 7 and just climb straight into bed, because I was just exhausted. And I couldn't figure out why. Again, I just thought I was lazy, or just like, why are my energy levels so low? I mean, I didn't have a dog by then, and actually having a dog has been life-changing in terms of understanding how I myself work. The idea that we tire out a dog not by throwing the ball endlessly so it's physically tired, we give them mental puzzles, because then they're mentally tired and then they go to sleep. Similarly, trigger stacking, like my dog's not going to yell at the postman because she's no longer afraid of the postman, but it will be like 9 little things before that haven't sort of taken her over threshold, and then she does end up sort of yelling at the postman, and that would exactly be my experience in the workplace. I also found it really infuriating that nobody worked as fast as I did, because then I'd get to sort of like the afternoon and I wouldn't have anything else to do, and I'd be staring at my watch going, what, I've got to sit here for like 2.5 hours, but there's literally nothing else for me to do, which is just infuriating. Presenteeism, I think, was one of my absolute biggest bugbears in a workplace. And so now, for the last few years, I've mostly been going in and out of offices as a contractor or freelance or something, and that's actually been quite freeing, because I can mask beautifully for a day or a week or a few weeks and that sort of thing, and that's great, but it doesn't get to a point when I'm not capable of doing that anymore, and then people are like, oh, why are you being a bit, what? I'm not being a bit, I'm just being me. Oh, hang on, sorry. I'm not being a bit, I'm just, blah, blah, blah. Would you like a cup of tea? That sort of thing. I just found and find a lot of working places where we are dealing with a lot of people with very different types of brains really quite difficult to understand. And I learned fairly early on that corporate workplaces, for example, were not necessarily for me, because there was a lot of, I don't know, unspoken language about how you were supposed to be. And I found it, I don't know, quite disingenuous and probably quite a naive way. Like I just wanted to turn up, do great work, get on with everybody and then go home. But as soon as, I don't know, people start talking in a certain way or a little bit as though there are just things that they're talking about that I'm not privy to, I'd just sort of get a bit lost and it wouldn't be very clear. Or if people, worst of all, sort of want you to assume that you've understood what they've said, and then if you go back and check, then they start getting a bit frustrated. It's all of these, which actually, to be fair, is not just an unspoken language of a workplace, it's just people not being very good at communicating themselves, but then not really liking it when that's sort of politely but inadvertently pointed out to them. So freelancing for me, and I'm making steps to move back into different types of work in a more permanent way at the moment, have been really good for sort of opening my eyes to that. But also the pandemic, as awful and as under recognised as certainly the most recent government has left it, there have been positive steps for inclusion in different workplaces in terms of remote working, in terms of hybrid working, and in terms of people recognising that everybody's got different stuff on, and as long as you get your work done, then that's the key thing.
And I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions from the audience as well. So let's maybe pivot to unmasking. So Ellie, how, for you, what does it mean? What are the things that keep you well?
Yeah, I think this is very much an ongoing journey of unmasking. I think when I first got diagnosed, so for context as well, my diagnosis and then it becoming my career were very, very quick together. So it's just over 2.5 years since I got diagnosed. And I've already got my first book out and my second book's coming out soon, and it's been my job for 2 years. So it was very much within 6 months of getting diagnosed, it was my full-time job to talk and speak and train people about these things, which is, when I look back now, I'm just like, that's just absurd. But so I think when I first was going through that sort of wild change in my life of I've just got this answer, I know who I am now, and I'm now, that's my whole job, to talk about these things. I sort of thought that was it. I thought that was unmasking, like, oh, I know who I am now, I know why I am that way, woohoo, like I can be myself now, I can be a bit more chaotic, that's it, done. And I thought that it was sort of almost like an orange, where it was just like the outer layer to peel off, and then inside would be the unmasked me. So I thought it was quite straightforward, whereas I think as time has gone on, I've realised it's more like an onion, that there is just layer after layer after layer after layer, and also when you're cutting off those layers, there are often tears involved. And I think that's sort of the best way that I can describe it, as it's a really ongoing process. So I think there are the top level stuff that I did straight away of being like, okay, I know that a 9 to 5 isn't for me, so that's unmasking by realising that I need to be freelance and I need to work on my own schedule, or I know that loud places aren't for me, so I'll make sure that I've got ear defenders, or I'll make sure that I've got time to decompress afterwards. And that they were sort of quite straightforward changes to make, but there's so much more than that, of like, I am the biggest people pleaser in the whole entire world, and that is so deeply ingrained into me that I don't even realise when I'm doing it at the time. Someone will ask me something and I'll go, yeah, of course, like that sounds great, that sounds amazing, and then afterwards I'm like, why did I just say yes to that? I actually don't want to do it. But that's so sort of because of masking, I had to stay safe, stay under the radar, make other people as like, that was sort of the only way to survive as someone that was so different and so sort of socially unaccepted, that it was like, well, if I just am as easy as possible to be around, and if I make people's lives as easy as possible, then that's the only way they're going to like me. So it's been so deeply ingrained into me that you make other people happy, you do what other people want you to do, and that's something that I've done my whole life. So it's going to take a while for me to even get to the point where I'm aware that that's happening, to be able to stop it. And I think, like so many other things, and I think like most or a lot of unmasking is quite freeing, as in like I don't get burnt out as frequently because I'm not spending so much energy in forcing myself through situations that are difficult for me. But then it's a lot of grief comes with it as well, I think, of you realise, you sort of wave goodbye to the life that you thought you were going to be able to live. And I think with that, there's a lot of things now that I really, really struggle with that I didn't realise that I struggled with beforehand. And so for example, like travelling, before the pandemic, I spent 2 years, my summers in Mallorca and my winters travelling around Southeast Asia, on flights all the time, on long night buses, on night trains, doing all sorts of things. And I thought I was fine, whereas now I struggle to get a 2-hour train to London because I'm just exhausted by the sound and the movement and the stress and all of those things. So it's like now I'm more conscious of that in the moment that it's difficult for me, whereas in the past I wouldn't realise how hard it was, and then I'd probably have a massive panic attack the day afterwards, and I think, why am I must be homesick, I must just be tired, like what's, and I wouldn't tie the two things together. So it's not that I was ever really able to do it, I was just forcing myself to do things that were outside of my capacity, but that was still gave me the option to be able to do it, whereas now the option's sort of not there because I'm more aware of how difficult it is in the moment. So I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, is that sort of skill regression of, I thought that I was able to just do everything and be normal and do everything that everyone else could do, and actually I can't do those things. Like that was fake the whole time. I was sort of pushing myself outside my comfort zone the whole time, and I think that's sort of a tricky thing to come to terms with, of actually every day for the rest of my life I'm going to have to carefully manage my energy and the amount of sensory input that I'm sort of aware of or happening or going through, and I'm going to have to think about this all of the time forever, is quite a really tricky situation to get your head around. And I think before you get the diagnosis, you still know that life isn't easy for you. You still know that things aren't going well, but there is still that hope of like, oh, well, you know, when I find the right antidepressants or when I find the right therapy, like I'll be a fully functioning fine human. One day it's there, someday, one day. And then when you discover that it's ADHD and autism, although that is like the best sort of acceptance and validation of, that's why things are so hard for me, there's also sort of the double whammy of, well, that means that it's never going away. Yes, I can do things to make my life easier. Yes, I can sort of downplay the amount of burnout that I'm experiencing, or I can accommodate myself, or I can ask other people to accommodate me. But fundamentally, my brain is going to have these challenges for the rest of my life, and I think that's a tricky thing to get your head around.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what you said in terms of it's not like you get a diagnosis and everything's fixed. Actually, it comes with so many different emotions, and it's not a one-off thing. It's not like, you know, here's a fix. No, it's a practice in a way, and obviously as you age, things change. You know, especially whether that's I suppose your circumstances, or whether it's hormonal changes, and Kat, you talk about that in the book as well. All of that, I suppose, is going to impact on us as neurodivergent people. And you mentioned acceptance as well, huge part of the journey as well. So, Kat, how are things for you in terms of that acceptance and learning about what you need, and I suppose making sure that you do what is good for you as much as possible?
I mean, I'd love to say that I do what's good for me as often as possible, but that's categorically incorrect. Acceptance. I always thought that acceptance was just like, oh yes, I'd love another biscuit, thank you very much. And I genuinely, it's been very humbling over the last few years, and I use that awful word quite lightly, to realise that actually acceptance, it's something that you do every day, like all the time. I have been an inveterate fixer of myself, of other people. I'm definitely somebody where I will impulsively try and offer a solution to somebody when all they want is to be listened to. And I once had a younger friend who would just be like, this is a listening moment actually, Kat. And I'd be like, oh, thank you very much. It's useful to let me know. But actually, when I was researching the book, I spoke to an amazing woman called Professor Susan Young. She's on lots of social media, but she co-founded the first ADHD clinic for adults in the Maudsley in the 90s. Because, spoiler, children with ADHD very often grow up to be adults with ADHD. And she said that actually, before getting into the Pomodoro technique and time management and executive dysfunction techniques and all this sort of stuff, a huge part of work that she would have to do with her adult clients is on acceptance. To accept that they were only finding out this huge truth about themselves at this point now, by which point, their past was probably, littered with embarrassments, with supposed failures, or certainly failures that they themselves held as being very real. You know, like relationship problems, friendship breakdowns, all of these sorts of things. And acceptance was not sort of like, that's fine, you know, everything's fine, brittle, very English. It was more just like, I'm somebody who has only now discovered this huge truth about themselves, and this now explains all of this rainbow of stuff that has gone on through my life. But I know that if I, you know, sit down and sort of really work with that, rather than trying to change myself or buy the latest supposed thing that's going to make my brain completely different, or a different type of tea or a mushroom to have in my tea or something like that, but just go, this is who I am. I'm somebody with ADHD. I'm somebody with a hip replacement. I'm somebody who can't have kids. I'm an alcoholic. You know, I'm working on all these things all the time. These are all facets of the person that I am. And it's really bloody hard because I just want to be Barbie. And alas, that position is taken. But that's what I mean by humbling. You know, we are, in our society, particularly in the UK, there is this idea of maximum productivity for minimum inconvenience to somebody else, particularly at work. And realising actually you are going to be inconvenient because, you know, you're going to have a finite amount of energy, or you'll have loads of ability on one day but maybe not on the next. Or certainly as a female person, you know, I'm going through perimenopause at the moment, which brings with itself a whole exciting raft of new hormonal changes. That's humbling as well, because so much of Western society really just values output and seeming and what seems. So accepting that I'm not going to be Barbie, in however that might manifest, yeah, that's a fairly ongoing thing. But it is a really worthwhile thing, because the more that we work with that, the more that we can stop beating ourselves up and accept, you know, I'm all right actually, and, you know, things are pretty good. And that's a really nice way to be.
Lovely, thank you so much. Shall we maybe open up for questions from the audience? Okay, so the question is, how easy was it to get a diagnosis as an adult? How long it took, and whether you decided to go private?
Yeah, so I went private for my diagnosis just because I felt like a sense of urgency. I was not in a very good place with my mental health, and it felt like I need these answers and I need something to change. I would say something that is worth looking into is the Right to Choose programme, which is essentially where the NHS will cover the cost of a private diagnosis, which generally speeds things up a bit. So if you just Google Psychiatry UK is sort of the main one that people would go through, but Right to Choose, that usually speeds it up slightly. I think even those waiting lists are quite long now because there's so many people trying to access it, but I believe with Right to Choose it's around 6 to 9 months-ish, I think. Yeah, that's probably the best option to look at for someone that's wanting to access a diagnosis.
Okay, I'll try and do justice to summarize it in a question. So the question is around, well, I suppose in a way letting go of things that have kept you safe, in terms of, you know, building certain barriers, protective mechanisms to get you to this stage, you know, to, I suppose, navigate adulthood, right? And now you are questioning, well, actually, is what I'm doing the most effective thing for me? And your question is, what can I do?
Yeah, I think patience and gentleness with yourself is the really important thing, because it's not easy, and those barriers and boundaries that you built for yourself, you've done from a place of self-protection and having no other choice but to do that. And I would say, where possible, therapy is sort of very helpful to explore those things. I think something that I, as of now, I'm really realizing is that, friendship-wise, I sort of convinced myself that I've built more friendships now, but they're very at a distance and they're mostly online and they're very controlled, and it's still, I'm not facing as much sort of upset as I did before when I didn't know, and I was having all of these social challenges, but I'm still not very happy because I'm keeping friends at a very sort of, they're not really friends still, they're just people that like me a bit more, but they're still just as equally far away. And I think that's frustrating because, again, I know that it's me that's pushing people away. It's me that's keeping them at a distance. But I think it's having that sort of compassion with yourself and going, well, actually, is there any wonder that I find it difficult to let people in when I've spent my whole life, whenever I have let people in, it's not gone particularly well. So I think sort of just, you know, thinking how you would think of like a child going through that thing, you would be a bit more, you wouldn't go like, why aren't you letting people in? You're being so silly, like you're being so stupid, you're ruining it for yourself. You'd go, I'm really sorry that you've had to go through all of those things that have made you feel like you need to keep people at a distance. What can I do, or what can we do to make you feel like a bit more safe to let those boundaries down? And I think just, being as gentle with yourself as possible and realizing that actually, although those boundaries, it feels frustrating and you know that it is harming you, it was there for a reason, it was there for a purpose. And I would say like support groups, like Kat mentioned, really would be helpful. I think making friends with other people with similar experiences where you can, talking to other people that are going through the same thing of late diagnosis and that unmasking process. And I think, if possible, therapy and just a safe place to sort of explore the whys behind it as well. Because I think, like you're saying, you can, if you can be more understanding of, well, why am I doing that? Well, I'm doing it because of all of these things that have happened in the past. Working through that is probably going to be the easiest way to start to build it down rather than just sort of brute force, I think.
Yeah. And the support groups aspect, there are quite a lot for ADHD on Zoom as well. So it's about 4 years since I got my diagnosis, and earlier this year I was really frustrated with myself that I wasn't doing better, because I was like, but I should be a perfect ADHD person by now. I've literally got a bloody book about it. What more do I need to do? And I realised through a fairly tortuous process that what I was doing was basically ignoring everything that I was feeling. I was basically masking in a different way. I was like I thought I was standing on a hill, but really it was a rubbish dump covered in a very thin layer of grass. And which is a horrible thing to realise, because I was like, I literally thought it was my anxiety, but I've got beta blockers for that. Why do I feel so bad? Literally because I was not feeling those feelings, because I don't want to. They're horrible. But you have to let the horrible pass through your body to feel it and release it. And, when we have been holding stuff in through whatever way, through whatever coping mechanism, for as long as we often have, that's really hard because it doesn't feel like a safe thing to do. And I certainly wouldn't classify myself as having an eating disorder anymore, but by God, I can still disordered eat with the best of them. And that was another frustration for me earlier this year. I mean, I joke about crispy M&Ms, but really, it was unmanageable. And something that has genuinely helped me, and admittedly this is because I'm in recovery in a different way as well, is I've started going, I can't believe I said this because I've never been a morning person, I've started going to an AA meeting at 7 a.m. every day. Obviously, that is completely not relevant for people who are not alcoholics, who are not in recovery. But for me, it's never been about the alcohol. It's always been about what on earth is going on in my brain. And I've been genuinely staggered, and I say that as somebody who will be celebrating 5 years of sobriety this summer, to discover only now that actually being in a room with people and talking about what's going on with me for 3 minutes tops, because I love a limit, that's really helpful. And it just means that I'm starting my day feeling like an aspect of my brain has been ironed. And I've been genuinely shocked that for the first time, and I swear to God, in my entire life, I've not been craving my usual foods. I do not even think about them at all. And that has literally never been the case, because for me, it's all about what's going on in my brain. So whether it is going for a walk with a friend who has a really nice dog, or listening to a meditation that you really like and just getting outside and maybe finding a group of people who are always walking their dogs at the same time. It's always the dog walkers for some reason. You'll never have to remember anybody's names because nobody cares about the people's names. It's only about the dogs. But finding some kind of connection in that way, horrifyingly, it is really, really important. However isolated or however much you feel, because we've just built up all those barriers. And we just need to reach through and be like, hello, I'm here. And this is what's going on for me in a little bit.
So let me summarize. So the question is, what can we accept? Can't we accept in terms of, well, a lot of it is to do with the society, with the structures, with, I suppose, the ways of living, modern living.
Yeah, I think for me, what really frustrates me is that it's sort of a lot of places don't meet my needs, or people or companies or whatever, and it's sort of the budging is always got to be on my side. So it's either I accept this place that isn't accommodating to me, or I miss out. So for example, like recently I got invited on this amazing brand trip and I was so excited, but I couldn't take a +1. I couldn't have the travel that I needed to have. I couldn't have the agenda that I needed. It wasn't going to meet my needs. So my choice was either, well, I go and I have a really awful time because I'm going to be overwhelmed and I'm not going to have a support worker with me. I'm going to be stressed, or I miss out on something that I really want to do. And I think that's, at the minute, it's still often seen as, they're not seen as needs, they're seen as like that I'm just being difficult, or that I'm just being a bit of a diva, or whatever it might be. They're seen as optional. Of me just going, it'd be really nice if I could have my friend come with me so that we can have a nice holiday. No, I need someone with me because I can't travel on my own, or I can't do those things on my own. I think that's what is really difficult for me, is we need people around us to start seeing needs as needs, trying to explain to people. It would be like saying, yes, wheelchair user, you can come on this trip with us, but you're going to have to walk up 5 flights of stairs to stay in your room. That's not possible for them to do, so they can't come on the trip. It's the same when my needs, just because they're not sort of physical needs, they're needs that you can't see. I think that's my biggest frustration at the moment, is we need people to respect our needs as needs, not as niceties or optional extras.
Yeah. Mine is bullshit, or bollocks, or whatever you like to call it. Part of the reason for calling this book It's Not a Bloody Trend is because bloody is, I think, the most English of words, but also because it's quite light. And the way that we deflect this nonsense that is going around, whether it is about trans people or ADHD or whichever the subject of the week is to be light and humorous about it, but also horrendously factual. That's so interesting that you think that. But did you know that actually ADHD was first listed in a medical textbook in the 18th century? Isn't that incredible? And actually, if you go back to this painting by Jan Steen from 1670 called The Village School, you can see hyperactive and impulsive symptoms literally writ large in there. I mean, obviously not as intense as that, because uncles don't tend to respond very well to that. But I think we have to think about this thing in society as an ongoing family disagreement. And with the best will in the world, I have tried to sulk my family into thinking what I think, and it has not worked. The only way to do anything like that, and I say this also as somebody I used to get brought onto Nick Ferrari's show on LBC as self-proclaimed feminist Cat Brown. So, yeah, you get an idea there. The only way that you can go against people who have any kind of, not thinking that you don't approve of, but thinking that it's just objectively bad, is to be light and humorous about it, because people don't like having things pointed out to them as like, you're wrong in this way. So it's not necessarily the finger waving, it's just that, oh, that's so interesting you think that, but you're completely wrong and here's why. But in a nicer way. That sounded very patronising. Again, that's because hopefully you're all on this page anyway, but it is really difficult. And I mean, I'm seeing quite a lot of my pals from school having been fairly brainwashed by Mumsnet and similar around trans kids. And it's just like, that's how I felt for a time at school during Section 28, because I didn't know any gay people and I didn't know better. They have not met a trans person because there are so few in UK society. And also, if you did meet one, you'd probably just be like, oh, well, you're a bloke. Or, oh, you're a woman. You wouldn't be like, oh my goodness, because nobody walks around with an ADHD badge or a trans badge or something. We just walk around, if anything, with like, I don't know, Nigel or something. And I think that's the thing to remember, is that society is not like this, but it's like this through periods. And that's why it's so important to inform ourselves about those waves when society has been through times of thinking, I don't know, like the deaf community did for a while, about outlawing sign language being taught in schools. That was something that deaf teachers did to themselves because of societal stigma. And, that was something that was only apologised for in the last 30 years. So it's just being aware of the fact that we are a constantly shifting and evolving society, but that things like, being ginormously tall, having red hair, having hair dye, these are all things that have been around for like millennia. And just because a newspaper has decided to print a really shitty headline does not make it true. So that's the way that we have to go through life. We have to navigate it with our grown-up brains on and our grown-up brain filters, and establish what is true, what is right, and, yes, what is kind.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining me, Ellie, and Kat for this wonderful panel. Kat and Ellie will be available to sign the book afterwards, so do go and meet them, and let's just finish with a round of applause.
Thank you.